Thank everybody. Thank you all for coming to the third lecture of the 20th Century Martyrs. Before we begin, ask Mary, Queen of Martyrs, to open our hearts to be enlightened by what we hear today. So in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, and the Son. Today, and as we keep going, to be honest, we just keep trying to, in each lecture, capture a wider and wider swath of persecution that goes on, if not longer in time, in more concerted ways. Not that the Mexican martyrs, the Spanish martyrs were not attacked any less brutally than anything that we want to talk about. But so, for instance, today we want to try to talk about the martyrs at the hands of the Nazi regimes during World War II. And it's quite a daunting task. You could do an entire six lecture series on everybody involved, and trying to find a foothold of where to begin. It's always a little difficult. When we look at the Mexican martyrs and the Spanish martyrs, especially for people of our times, it's a little easy because just talking about it at all opens up a reality and a worldview that most people aren't familiar with. So just to get it out on the table, so to speak, and to say names starts to be enough. World War II, unfortunately, its horror has become far too familiar with all of us, and you see this, if you're having an argument, the quicker you can make your opponent somehow relatable to the Nazis, the more we think you're going to win this argument. Nazis have become almost a silly caricature of evil instead of really getting into the depths of what was truly horrific about what they did. Quentin Tarantino's movie, The Inglourious Bastards, for instance, Nazis are these people that you can stand up as shadow puppets and massacre, and everybody in the crowd, claps because we feel good about it. This sort of drenching of knowledge we have about the Nazi regime and the Holocaust itself, strange enough, provides a distance from what's going on, and provides this difficulty of beginning the lecture today. So I decided to bring up at the beginning maybe two of the most famous martyrs, not to drown out some of the lesser known martyrs that I want to pick up towards the end of the lecture, but because we know these two martyrs so well, perhaps we can give, of course not an explanation for what went on, but a context for what modern martyrdom looks like, specifically in the face of something so horrific as a very well planned out persecution of the Nazis in World War II. So to start out with Edith Stein, who of course eventually becomes the martyr Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. And that of the Cross is what I want to first point out with her life. Everybody I talk about today, there's going to be some better book to explain the life in general. I hope to bring out fragments of their life in order to make things sort of interconnect, but also, like I said, maybe give a little bit of context to how we should view these things. So if Edith Stein, there's wonderful books, particularly about her philosophical life by Alistair MacIntyre. The Carmelites have a lot of literature about her conversion and her ultimate martyrdom. She became a student of philosophy, of the phenomenologist of Edmund Husserl. She was somewhat of a contemporary with Heidegger, who any student of philosophy has to come across pretty much at some point in modern day philosophy. She was a deep thinker, well entrenched in the German phenomenological and really modern understanding of what philosophy means. But she was also Jewish, and at the time had lost her faith. Her parents, in particular her mom, were incredibly devout Jews. But she, like a lot of Germanic Jewry at the time, they'd become, it's always sad to think about this, that the Jews in Germany and Austria-Hungarian Empire were perhaps the most well accepted of all European Jewry. And I don't want to overload this. It wasn't like they had complete freedom. They were still pretty much second-class citizens in many ways. But up until the regimes that would become the Nazi, the Third Reich, and its counterpart in Austria-Hungary, Jews in those places in the Mittel Europa, really enjoyed a flourishing in European culture that they had not seen for a long time. Edith Stein comes from one of these families, and this is what allows her, as not only a Jew but a woman as well, to work her way up through the university ranks and become a PhD, a scholar in the field of philosophy. But along her path, like I said, I don't want to, this will just be fast forwarding through most of her very intriguing life. She eventually does become Catholic, and part and parcel of this is Teresa of Avila, the great Carmelite mystic, who draws her to the faith and answers many questions that Edith Stein had in her life up until that point. And so she does eventually join. She quits her job as a PhD, and at this point in her life, even turning down a teaching position in Latin America that most likely would have saved her life in order to enter a Carmel and become a Carmelite. And not only did she have to face what would eventually become the perpetrators of her martyrdom and the racism against Jews that had already started brewing in her Germany, but a mom who stayed Jewish, at least it seems till the very end. Their experiences upon her death in her biography make that somewhat debatable. But her mother stayed a very thoroughgoing practicing Jew and did not love at all her daughter converting and then becoming, in this final step, enclosed in a Carmelite monastery. What I want to point out with Edith Stein, though, is very clear early on, as someone who believes herself to be both Jewish and Christian. So Edith had no opposition in her mind between being a Jew and a Christian. In fact, they both had a special place for her personally. She was quoted remarking to Father Johannes Hirschmann, "You do not know what it means to me to be a daughter of the chosen people, to belong to Christ not only spiritually but according to the flesh." For Edith Stein, being both, and in this particular time in history, meant everything to her. So I don't know how much you know about the Carmelites, but the Carmelites see their origins all the way back to Elijah. So Mount Carmel, they literally get their name. So the Great Carmel in Palestine, which stands near the caves where Elijah once dwelled, and the personal experience of reading St. Teresa of Avila became for her a living symbol for the way in which Judaism branched into Christianity. For Edith Stein, in her own life, there couldn't be nothing could be more perfect than the Carmel, the Carmelite monastery, the entering into the cave with Elijah that flowered into the cross of Jesus Christ. Like I said, her mother did not understand this, and Frau Stein saw the deep piety of her daughter at prayer, but could not understand ultimately what it all meant. But Edith, beyond simply in her own life saying, as a Jew, Carmelites would be perfect for me, or that the Jewish mark of the Carmelites would endure in her conversion of Christianity, she saw her life and the willingness of the Carmelites to see the devotion of the religious as a certain sacrifice. She could not help but see this as something that she was already doing for her people, the Jews particularly, in the coming pandemonium that was about to come. So Edith began seeing this early in her days, becoming a Carmelite. Edith Stein was always a hard worker, but she'd always been quite the intellectual. She produced a lot of writing. She'd read a lot of books, had done a lot of teaching. But here she was, a 40-year-old woman, entering the Carmelites and having to do what every Carmelite novice had to do. So she was scrubbing floors, doing needlework, doing the things that she had not been used to doing her entire life. Characteristically, Stein said she never laughed so hard and so much as during this period when her inadequacies were revealed for all to see. For Edith, even joining the monastery and being shown how inadequate she was in these basic things, or even these base things, set her up for the sacrifice of the cross that she saw herself joining in Jesus Christ. So before she entered the Cologne Carmel, she mentioned to the prioress during their first conversation together, thinking about her own life but attaching it to the situation in Germany. Human activity cannot help us, but only the passion of Christ, and my desire is to share in that. So, and especially, this is the truth of all religious life and all monastic life, but the Carmelites, this is a strict understanding. This is why John of the Cross writes about the dark night of the soul, or the sheer passion of Christ as being emblematic of everything that would go on. So whether it's little things like learning to sweep for the first time, or ultimately walking serenely into the death camps of the Nazis that would kill her, Edith Stein saw her entire life in Christ as this preparation for sacrifice for the behest of others. So during this period, events outside and inside the Carmel seemed to be coming together for her into one single act. The very day of her profession, a friend expressed relief that at least she would be safe in the convent. But the now Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, her name is very emblematic, had chosen her religious name because she believed she was blessed by the Lord's suffering. She anticipated that she would have to share in that passion. About her supposed security, she replied, "I do not think so. The Nazis will surely get me out of here. In any case, I cannot count on being left in peace here." And according to the friend, it was clear to her that she was going to suffer for her people, and that she was meant to bring many home through her sufferings. To be a child of God, she said, that means to be led by the hand of God, to do the will of God, not one's own will, to place every care and every hope in the hand of God, and not to worry about one's future. So her mom eventually dies in 1936. This allows her sister Rosa to be received into the church. She's baptized December 15th, 1936. And starts to try to enter into the process of the Carmelites as well. Passing the torch of martyrdom, I try to show how, unfortunately, it seems like the torch of martyrdom is like a baton being passed in this long marathon race of the 20th century. Edith Stein, about this time in the Carmel, was receiving the horrible news about what was happening to the Spanish Carmelites at the hand of the Republicans in Spanish Civil War. And even by 1937, the sort of horror of the modern scourge against the church was hitting home for the Carmelites. In her personal life, by Easter of 1937, Dr. Herschel, who I was saying was the preeminent philosopher of the time in phenomenology, even his preeminence couldn't stop him from being driven out of his position at Freiburg because of the anti-Semitic laws. And he had taken up asylum with his wife in the convent of St. Lioba. Even high regard at this point couldn't save anyone from the machinations that were beginning to happen. In 1938, they started having elections in Germany that they were supposed to be a secret ballot, but everybody began to understand fully that the ballots would be read. And so at the time, people were saying it wouldn't be prudent to vote against the Nazis even if we agree, because this will only cause us problems. Sister Teresa Benedicta said no. And not only saying no or refusing to vote in the end like they did, The Nazis came by to collect ballots, and when they saw that Dr. Edith Stein was a non-Aryan, they made note of the fact and left. Dr. Stein was familiar enough with the ways of the world to know that she was a danger to her whole community in Germany. She immediately began making efforts to be transferred to the Carmel in Bethlehem. Unfortunately, Nazi authorities were then denying visa to German Jews who wished to go to Palestine because they saw this as a way for them to escape. On November 8th, 1938, when the the Kristallnacht occurred, it was obvious that Jews everywhere were threatened. Teresa Benedicta notes this as, "This is the shadow of the cross falling on my people. This is the fulfillment of the curse that my people had called down on itself." Yet again, this is her word speaking as a Jew. "Cain must be persecuted, but woe to him who touches Cain. Woe also to the city and this country where God shall revenge what is today done to the Jews." Several of Edith Stein's siblings managed to immigrate to the United States and elsewhere. The prioress of the Carmel, where she was at in Cologne, seeing that Jewish Christians were no longer safe in Germany, sent Edith to the Carmel in Echt, Holland, on December 31st in 1938. And again, it started to seem that Edith would be safe and that her martyrdom, her suffering that she showed would be spiritual in nature. However, of that year on Passion Sunday, more prophetic words comes from the saint herself. So on Passion Sunday, she wrote the prioress with a remarkable request. "Please may your reverence allow me to offer myself to the heart of Jesus as a sacrifice of expiation for true peace, that the reign of the Antichrist might perish, if possible without a new world war, and a new order may be established. I should like to do this today because it is the 12th hour. I know that I am nothing, but Jesus desires it, and he will certainly call many others to this in these days." The hidden mysteries which she had earlier spoken of as the driving force of history emerge here in concrete terms. It's easy to read words of saints in retroactive detail and think that, oh, of course, that's what a saint would say. But Edith Stein, when she starts out her life, does not beforehand know that she will be Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, just like Augustine doesn't know who ends his days as Bishop Augustine, for instance. When we read these things, and if we want to get the true sort of force of the prophetic words, we have to think back about how unclear everybody else was at the time. Bishops at the time didn't know how to deal with the Nazis, neither did secular authorities. There was no clear route in how you would deal with people with such ambitious aims. It's kind of hard. People of all centuries who are trying to claim to be the next big thing in the world always speak big, always act underhanded, always do things that run counter to what would seem like human decency. And the perpetual bully in the yard is always a difficult thing to worry about. If you try to punish the bully, it only invigorates the bully to think that they truly are somehow stomped upon and must act out. Germany at the time, after the Weimar Republic had failed so horribly, after the striking of the Allies against Germany after World War I, feeds off the general discontent of the German people. If rest of Europe tries to impose its will on the Nazis to beat them down, it only adds as one more notch in the rhetorical belt. On the other hand, if you stand to do nothing, it seems like you enable them too. It legitimizes them as a force in the play yard. What are people to do? What are the bishops to do? What are the leaders to do? What are individuals to do about what is going on? Edith Stein saw her life as an immediate answer to the sheer carnage that would break out in the coming years. In 1940, her sister Rosa managed to make her way to Echt in seeming safety. So St. Teresa of Benedicta and her sister, who was not professed as a Carmelite, only showed interest in if I'm bleeding that wrong. But anyway, she makes it up to Echt. The two sisters had at least the consolation of facing the future together. And St. Teresa Benedicta was devoting 7 hours a day to prayer and rapidly learning Dutch. Everything seemed to be okay, but then the Germans invaded Holland and yet again brought danger close. Edith Stein believed it was important to go on with duties and not letting the turmoil outside gain any control of her peace. Ironically, the last thing she was ordered to do by the prioress of Echt was to write a study of St. John the Cross. It was the last writing she would ever do. It's known as The Science of the Cross and appears posthumously, setting up her life intellectually to live out what she would publish later. In addition to her numerous prayers offering herself up for reparation, Stein, like I said, had several chances to escape her whole situation. There was the teaching position in Latin America that she refused. However, hers was not a blind sacrifice. She had sought asylum for herself at her sister Rosa in the Carmel in Switzerland. For Stein, this was following the biblical principle of Matthew 10:23, when you are persecuted in one town, take refuge in another. In truth, I say to you that you will not have finished all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man has come. Tragically, though, the Swiss convent had room for Edith, a professed member. It was already too crowded to take Rosa. And since leaving her sister behind was out of the question, Edith stayed in Echt. She refused to go into hiding. Many Jews had done so in Holland, and it makes sense. It's not to bash anyone who would go into hiding in this dire situation. But Edith Stein saw herself as a Carmelite and as a, if not a public figure, a public spiritual presence. She even had priests asking her to do so. But first, she was worried about the fact that it would bring reprisals against the Echt Carmel. If the Nazis came knocking on the door, and the very obvious Jewish Edith Stein, Sister Teresa Benedicta, was not there, she feared what would come about in her place. Though these would have probably been of limited duration, she was not willing to risk the others on her behalf. Second, she was reluctant to do something illegal, and in a state reminiscent of Socrates' refusal to escape from prison despite his innocence, that you can look at in the four dialogues surrounding his execution. Yet again, characteristically, and in the book Robert Royal, he keeps saying this about Edith Stein, and I think it's the best word, characteristically. She had a character that you could rely on. She also mentions that Protestants in Germany were always slandering Catholics for lying, much less Nazis, and she would not provide any public pretext for the charge of being untruthful. In the final account, we have to say that for multiple reasons, she refused an ignoble way of saving herself, and as a result, fell afoul of the Nazi machinery. Given the fate this moral purity meant, we can only regard her as a martyr, and not simply another victim. A victim, in a certain way, carries the notion of sheer accident. And in her prophetic words, Edith Stein seems already to know the sacrifice that she will be making in terms not only for herself, but for her people, both Jews and Germans. Now this is where things in her life, of course, precipitate to the end, but also have ramifications for the story hopefully we can get to later. There was a telegraph. We have to give it to the people of Holland. They stood in one accord very much so against the mistreatment of Jews. The church leaders made a final objection in 1942 against the clearing of Jews, at least the Catholic, the Christian Jews, as they'd say. The church leaders made a final point objecting to Nazi treatment of Jews, Jewish converts to Christianity, which prevented them from exercising religious liberty. Notice how the argument has to fall. At least you can't take away the religious liberty there. Of course, this would fail too. The telegram did gain a brief respite for the Jewish Christians, but the deportation of other Jews continued as planned. Church leaders planned public protest, but the leader of the Nazis in Holland heard it and forbade it. A few leaders complied, in some cases out of fear, and others out of the prudential calculation that it's the best way to avoid reprisals. Among those who refused to comply was the Catholic Archbishop of Utrecht. He ordered a pastoral letter to be read in all the parishes of Holland on July 26, 1942. In it, he directly accuses the Nazis of going against the will of God and calling his people to not comply with their evil demands. And it was a bold gesture indeed, but it had disastrous results. The German authorities began considering whether to nationalize some of the Catholic charitable institutions in Holland because of the bishop's interference. And on a side note, this comes up very importantly, it is suggested very strongly that Pius XII was hesitant to make too much open criticisms of the Nazis, given the Dutch example, and he was worried that it might provoke even wider retaliation. And at the time, and right after the war, his quiet exhortations on the behalf of Jews earned him wide respect from Jews at the time, including Einstein, the chief rabbi at Rome, who in fact he and his wife converted to Catholicism later. Today, his prudence is often considered as a moral failure. Yet again, I go back to ask, what is the necessarily right way? With hindsight, I don't think even then we can tell. People who stand up to the Nazis, like the church actually had done, hopefully we can talk about that a little bit, how the church had tried to stand up to them, but after the invasions had already occurred, all direct standing up to Nazis led to the deportation of Jews, oftentimes priests as well. Whether that's what you needed to do anyway is a debate to set aside. But Edith Stein and her sister Rosa were among those ordered to pack a few belongings and proceed to the SS police station. Their departure was heartrending. The streets were filled with Dutch anti-Nazi protesters, but the two sisters were quickly taken to the police station. After this, our knowledge of what exactly happens to Edith Stein begins to fade away, and only trickles of information survive. One survivor reports that while Edith was still calm, she displayed a profound sense of sorrow. Westerbrook, the survivor, said, a pieta without the Christ. She was known to have been on trains that in fact went through her hometown. In fact, it is purported that she said, "This is my home and I'll never see it again." We will never know for sure what exactly happened, but according to Nazi records, Sister Teresa Benedict of the Cross died on August 9th, 1942, in an Auschwitz gas chamber. Only a week earlier, she had just been a cloistered sister in the contemplative stillness of the Eck Carmel, seeking to live the truth. But to start off with Edith Stein is to give a profound context to what martyrdom is, as not simple victimhood. And yet again, this is not to cast any moral aspersions of being a victim, but martyrdom takes its understanding not simply in a heroic, showing a heroic face in the terms of danger, and not simply being someone who has the ill fortune of living in a world where evil people do evil things, but living a life that is circumscripted by the reality of Jesus Christ and how he makes the world different. Edith Stein may not have had a story that we could tell like we do some of the old martyrs who were publicly executed, and we have the words they said, or we have writings of the letters they wrote right before they were killed. But we see with Edith Stein the preparation she makes for the death that she was to offer up, to be made united with her Lord and for the sake of others. Another famous saint that shows this same thing, and again, sort of the passing of the torch, from Edith Stein, who dies in Auschwitz, to St. Maximilian Kolbe, and his death as well. Again, we'll talk about what he does, but it's important to know that one of the most famous devotions that we get from St. Maximilian Kolbe, we usually hear about two forms of the total consecration to the Virgin Mary. St. Louis de Montfort's is perhaps, if not the more famous, maybe the longer established, because, of course, it was just longer in time that it's been around. But the other famous is St. Maximilian Kolbe, who preached that if people wanted to rely completely on Jesus, they had to learn to offer themselves through Mary, that Mary was their mother, that if they relied on Mary, it's not that everything would turn out well, but that everything would turn towards God. And that this devotion permeates the life that he asks people to lead in order to live the will of God. And in his life, for what he does in the camp at Auschwitz, it does nothing more but reflect this simple, saintly understanding of what the Christian life is. So on July 31st, 1941, a prisoner in Auschwitz from Block 14 escaped. The camp guards set up roadblocks for miles around, and the German shepherds, the dogs, were put on the trail. That night, the other prisoners in Block 14 were interrogated about where the escapee went or how it happened. Already emaciated from months of heavy works, they had no dinner. The next day, they stood at attention in the hot sun without food or water as the Nazis searched. By evening, the deputy commander at Auschwitz, an officer named Fritsch, announced in no little irritation to the Polish swine that 10 of them would be chosen to go to Block 13, where they would pay in the usual way for their friend. Block 13 was this, well, let me get there. So in many ways, it doesn't matter who dies, because most people will end up dying. Auschwitz mows under people like a lawnmower mows grass. But when it comes down to how you die, even when we get to the sort of cruel crucible that is Auschwitz, we start to understand that there are much better or worse ways to die. So in a battle, a gunshot wound, or being electrocuted, given the alternatives, would at least be a quick passage with little pain. Other punishments like back-breaking labor or starvation were a slow slide into the darkness. But nothing, even within Auschwitz, was more fearsome than Block 13, because it was the starvation bunker. And anything named the starvation bunker would fill anybody with dread. No one ever returned. That if you were there until you died. It was a virtual tomb. Prisoners selected there for death lived in total darkness, and their only touch with the outside world was when once a day the guards would walk in to remove the bodies of the dead. They had no food, they were not allowed to talk, and the worst of this, of course, was the lack of water. Prisoners drank their own and each other's urine just to try to live, and when these dried up, they underwent what the doctors know to be one of the most hideous ways to die, the slow collapse of the system from thirst, with all physical and mental agonies it entails. Many went mad in the sadistic conditions, and that was the entire point. So many people, as they were being randomly chosen as the 10 from Block 14, knew that they were going off to die, and some of them would try to be brave. So long, friends. Long live Poland. Last defiant messages. In this group, however, one man, prisoner 5659, a Sergeant Francis Gojowanczyk, sorry for me, I'm bad at saying Polish names, but he broke down crying and said, "My poor wife, my poor children, goodbye." And it was a scene that people probably saw 1,000 times, people finally begging for their life, and the people not giving two cares about what they asked. But prisoner 16670 began to walk up to the commandant, and this was a bold act in itself, since any unauthorized move by prisoners was usually met with being shot down dead immediately. But miraculously, prisoner 16670 went up to the officer without incident, and in German asked, "I would like to die in place of one of these men." Even more miraculously, the brutal and sardonic French did not dismiss the ragged prisoner, did not shoot him out of hand, but asked why. It was a delicate question. Now, even if he got up there and had avoided all this, he still had more to maneuver. Prisoner 16670 cited a Nazi principle If he had gone anything towards resembling heroism or defiance or spirit, he again would have been shot dead. The Nazis couldn't allow someone to show off in any way. So instead, he recites Nazi jargon back. "The sick and the weak must be liquidated," he said. "And I am an old man, sir, and good for nothing. My life is no longer of use to anyone." Fridge inquired whose life he wanted to trade. And he said, "Whoever it was that had the wife and children." "Who are you?" And he said, "A Catholic priest." Now someone who was less blinded by the fog of hatred might understand what this man was doing. That in the middle of a world where human beings were pitted against each other like dogs, and their very humanity was trying to be stripped, that this man was showing a beacon of humanity by willingly choosing to replace the father of children. But I guess fortunately for that man, the father of the children, Fritsch was an animal, and all that he heard was the despised word of priest. And he knew that priests, next to the Jews, were the vilest things that needed to be eradicated from the earth. So Fritsch ordered his assistant Polish to cross out the number 5659 and add 16670. And 16670 was the Franciscan Father Maximilian Kolb, who walked to his death willingly to save the life of a father. So in this instance, Robert Royal says, we can say the whole machinery of death was broken and reversed by a man who acted in utter freedom to give his life for another. Crazy, this prisoner 5659, his name, like I said, Gajawinsk. I'm sorry, I messed it up so bad. He ended up living for 54 more years. He actually died in the 90s. During his life, he was miraculously cured of spinal tuberculosis, which I didn't even know existed, but sounds terrible. But not only surviving Auschwitz, he survives the tuberculosis of the spine he contracts at Auschwitz, and he assesses it to Kolb's intercession. The harsh conditions in Auschwitz usually set men fighting against each other. I don't need to go into too much detail. You can read the horrible accounts in many books. But Kolb's Christian act introduced something that Auschwitz could not take. He had shown that the greatest humanity and human dignity was possible even in the face of the worst torture anyone could conceive. One of the reasons we have such relatively good information about the whole matter is that nothing in Auschwitz could obliterate it from their memories, and this act lives. I mean, this is 1941, and this act survives in the stories of most of the campers, of the people who were at the camp in Auschwitz. Now, nor was the choice to die the last noble act of Kolbe's memorable life, although it would have been plenty. There's actually much more that happened. Like I said, I'm so bad at Polish names, but a doctor named Bruno served, well, he might have not been a doctor. At any rate, he served as an interpreter and a kind of undertaker for the starvation bunker. And he provides stunning accounts of what happened. They were all ordered to strip naked. The guards shoved them into the dark hole, and they said, one of their favorite things, "You will dry up like tulips," saying that they would all die, shrivel up in a matter of no time. They all died, but not like the flowers that bloom one day and are gone the next. Thanks to Kolb, they died like men. As Bruno later described with astonishing change, it doesn't even seem like the starvation bunker. When I go down there, it's like descending into the crypt of a church. Kolb had organized all the people locked in there to sing hymns and recite the rosary. Quoting in Bruno, sometimes they would be so absorbed in prayer that they would not even realize the guards had come for the daily inspection and had opened the door of their cell, and only after the SS began shouting at them would they stop praying. It was as if in the darkness of Auschwitz, the isolation of this cell was something like a monastery or a better world. A few men, of course, almost died immediately. They'd been so weakened by everything before. Kolbe kept up the courage of the others, and remarkably was the last to grow weak. This makes very little sense because he suffered tuberculosis for decades. He essentially was living with only one operating lung, and just a few months before had actually been at the dreaded infirmary of Auschwitz, thinking he was on his deathbed. And he literally was the last one to die out of this group of 10 put in the starvation chamber. So he did all of this and more without complaint, all the way to his end in the starvation bunker. Even the guards began to notice. When they came for their daily inspection to remove the dead, they always found Kolb either standing or kneeling in serenity. The others were usually sprawled out in one place or another. One of the guards said in the hearing of Bruno, that priest is a real man. He never had one like that before. In fact, the real man and 3 of his followers wore out the patience of the guards. The cell was needed for other prisoners. So August 14th, 1941, and remember this whole debacle started July 31st. So August 14th, 1941, the vigil of the Feast of the Assumption, which for a Franciscan like Maximilian would be a very honorable day. They ordered Dr. Bach to inject the surviving men with carbolic acid. It was astonishing that they had all lasted 2 weeks without air, food, light, and on top of this, water, after they'd been abused in camp for that whole time, and even more so because Kolb, before he ever even entered the death camps, was considered critically ill. He could no longer stand or kneel, and he sat propped against the wall. Bach came in and injected the other 3 men, and the poison worked quickly, and within seconds they were dead. So he turned to Kolb, who was praying. And without interrupting his prayer, Kolb offered his arm to the executioner. Bruno, who has been saying, he got so emotional at the sight of this that he made an excuse and went outside. And when the doctors and the guards emerged, he knew it was all over. Most of his account of Kolb is quite sober, but even he was moved to a kind of dark poetry by what he then saw. When I opened the iron door, Father Kolb was no longer alive. His face had an unusual radiance about it. The eyes were wide open and focused on some definitive point. His entire person seemed to have been in a state of ecstasy. I will never forget that as long as I live. Strangely, the end of Father Kolb, and we're not sure why this was decided or how, but the men who were there found a pine coffin, and he was one of the few people to go into the gas chambers in a coffin. And beyond just the mere recitation of the heroism or the unbelievability, if you will, of this being clearly marked out about, in the face of impossible circumstances, what Father Kolb did. Yet again, to give context to what we mean by martyrdom, to not just make it a simple listing of what the Nazis were able to pull off in the sheer horrific power that they wielded, this devotion and total giving away to Mary, Maximilian reflects in himself. It's as if when he offers his arm for the injection, he does not need anything else but to know that he's already been accounted for. And whatever else a martyr is, like we say with Edith Stein, the willingness to die for others and to die in order to conform to Christ, this utter childlike belief that even in the face of the worst human persecutions, nothing can really get to you in the way that they hope. Father Kolb is emblematic of how we should understand this, that in the face of horrible inhumanity, someone was human enough and free enough to show that even they could choose what was right in the midst of all this horror. So with that, to set up, like I said, this sort of bookends to understanding what we would look at with the Nazi juggernaut, as Robert Royal describes this in his book, I just hope to highlight some of the things to point out that usually get left out in the accounts of the Nazi regime. Like I said, the Third Reich, it's almost sad how much airplay they get on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, etc. It's almost giving them too much credit. after the fact. The fact that we can watch the wretchedness of World War II and just sort of flippantly go, oh, there's another World War II movie, is sort of disgusting. But I do want to try to point out what is often overlooked, and that is the Nazi government's definitive decision that Catholicism at some point must be rooted out just as much, because of their association with Catholicism, with Judaism, which hopefully we can get to here in a second. But to throw out other lives that don't get as much attention as St. Edith Stein and St. Maximilian Kolbe. On November 9th, 1942, Jacob Gap crossed into southern France from Spain, so from a free area into occupied France. He was traveling in a car with two friends who a few months earlier had asked him, a Marianist priest from Austria, to instruct them in the Catholic faith. In a complex covert operation, he was arrested by waiting guards from the pro-Nazi Vichy government in France. The Gestapo briefly debated whether they would put him through the process of sending him to Dachau or not, and Dachau becomes the camp of choice for arrested priests. But they decided he was a dangerous prisoner and they kept him under special protective custody. So later, a people's court trial, which lasted less than 2 hours, sentenced him to death, commenting he will forever be without honor. So the evening of August 13th, 1943, 13 years to the day that Gap had began his novitiate with the Marianists, he wrote his last letter to the superior of the order, saying, "Today I hope to begin the life of eternal happiness." Then he went calmly on to the execution shed and was beheaded, earning not Nazi honor, but eternal honor. So Nazis used this Jewish ploy, so to speak, to apprehend Gap. The two friends were supposedly German Jews that were looking into to convert. And this sort of double insult to what was going on is just par for the course with what the Nazi regime thought that they were trying to do. The numbers, again, are horrifically remarkable, and this is just a recurring theme that we're going to hear. Robert Royal puts it so clearly about how horrific it is. Among German Catholic priests alone, in 1932, just prior to Nazi rising to power, there were about 21,000 Catholic priests in Germany. Of these, more than a third, so over 8,000, clashed with the Reich. Several hundred have been documented as being perished at Nazi hands. So those are priests we know by Nazi records they were killed. And no doubt many others who will forever remain unknown were eliminated as well. Hitler, in public, tried to distance any sort of public persecution of the faith, but in private he let his true feelings be known. So, I quote, "Why not? That will not prevent me from totally uprooting Christianity in Germany and eliminating it lock, stock, and barrel. It is, however, decisive for our people whether they have the Judeo-Christian faith and its flabby morality of sympathy, or a strong, heroic faith in God and nature, in God and one's own people, in God and one's own fate, in God and one's own blood. One is either a Christian or a German. One cannot be both." So instead of a direct attack, Hitler planned and carried out a program of pretending that the Christians he arrested were executed for other activities that were against the state. And again, this starts sounding all too familiar. He expressed his intentions to crush the Catholic Church like a toad, but he wanted to do so as much as possible without it being noticed. He was hoping that the church would then see fighting Nazi power was useless, but he didn't realize that the struggle that was about to become very much noted. So Nazi persecution of Catholic clergy and resistors both inside and outside Germany was intense. Bedřich Hoffmann, a Czech priest who spent the years 1940 to 1945 in Buchenwald and Dachau, vowed while still in camps that he would try to document what was going on. So at great risk to his life, this priest interviewed prisoners and even slipped into offices and secretly tried to keep files or memorize what he knew what was happening. So even his necessarily incomplete survey indicates that Dachau alone, which was for some unknown reason the Gestapo's favorite camp for clergy, though priests died in every camp in the Third Reich. So at one point Dachau held 2,670 priests from Albania, Belgium, Croatia, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, England, France, Germany, Greece, Holland, Italy, Luxembourg, Norway, Poland, Serbia, Slovenia, Spain, Switzerland, Yugoslavia, and other countries still. Of these, almost 600 died in camp. Another 325 died during so-called transport of invalids to other sites. So this is a euphemism for secret execution. 2 bishops, Michael Kozol of Poland, who was brutally tortured after being arrested merely as a potential anti-Nazi leader, had died. And then Gabriel Piguet of Clermont-Ferrand in France, apprehended for having sent priests to hear confessions of resistance fighters, also died in Dachau. Hoffman's figures, as high as they are actually probably lower, because we know he could not get all of the actual accurate data. By careful study of the numbers assigned to prisoners where they were arrested, he had been able to document that hundreds of priests designated for transport from Poland to Dachau and about a dozen large groups simply disappeared and were left unrecorded. So for instance, the notes like this: the 6th shipment, one of the largest, came on October 31st, 1941 from the Polish prisons at Kostynawa and Posen. The numbers were 28,026. These are the names of the people. So Stanislaw Ovskarzrek, to 28,509, Waclaus Frignoka. From this contingent that remained at this time of liberation, only 130 out of 483. The rest had been liquidated by violent death. Hitler's intention was particularly gruesome against Polish people in general, who he saw as sort of the next most worthless people after the Jews, and particularly the Polish clergy. He had an exceptional hatred. The Poles were the largest group at Dachau, numbering 1,780 clergy, and we can only speculate about the numbers who never arrived from Poland and other Nazi-occupied nations. The Nazis gave various reasons for imprisoning the clergymen: stirring up the masses, spying, aiding prisoners, suspicion of treason, behavior unfriendly to Germany, support of Jews, insulting the Führer or National Socialism, or sometimes no reason at all. One was sentenced for telling school children to love their enemies. 12 were rounded up after reading The Lion of Münster, Bishop Clemens August von Galen's condemnation of euthanasia from the pulpit. Father Otto Neurohrer arrived in Dachau for hindering an Aryan marriage because he wouldn't let a 60-year-old marry a teenager, and they threw him in jail for this. Some prisoners say that the report was that he was crucified upside down for 36 hours, and that's how he died. Father Karl Lampert, the pro-vicar of Innsbruck, was picked up and shipped to Dachau for inciting the people by the mere fact of announcing Neuer's death, the person I just said. He had no details, he just mentioned that he had died. The president of the court that had heard the case shot himself in the head rather than be an accomplice to the trial. Put in isolation, Lambert was interrogated brutally. At one point, his tormentors asked him which was more valuable, the Mein Kampf of Hitler or the Bible, and when he responded the Bible, they killed him straight afterwards. Now, as this has been sort of showing out in the 20th century, most of these the persecutions of the 20th century fell hardest on men, mostly because men were more involved in the political life and the ecclesial life. So the Nazis did not execute many women, but they did, obviously with Edith Stein, and also hated particularly Catholic nuns who had played a central role in the education of Germany and Austria. And just like the same fact when we looked at horror about what happened to the Spanish nuns, both in Spain and then in the Mexican nuns in Mexico, inasmuch as they didn't suffer as much direct death, it was even more profound when they killed them because, like I said, they had so little direct conflict with the political powers at the time. But since nuns had played such a big deal in the German and Austrian education system, the Nazis strategically tried to make the nuns submissively become irrelevant. So after the Anschluss, SS officers would chide nuns that in 10 years they'd be honoring Adolf Hitler on altars instead of Christ. And so unafraid, one sister replied, "If Hitler is prepared to die on the cross for his people and then rise from the dead on the third day, I'll change my habit to a Nazi uniform, but not before." The Nazis did not always take such sharp retorts kindly. So a nursing nun, Sister Maria Restituta, was arrested because she was using dangerous language in an operating room. All she did was talking about Christ over the policies of the Nazis. But she was imprisoned for simply saying a few words. We're just running out of time. There's, if you've ever had the chance to learn about, where is her name at? Sister Angela, but she's often known as the Angel of Auschwitz, right? Yes, the Angel of Auschwitz, and her behavior towards everyone to try to help alleviate the darkness and burden of being put in the death camp made her well enough known that this story about the Angel of Auschwitz survived after all of those years. With the last remaining few minutes, it's always, teaching a class like this, I always have to think about, what do I even teach? What's the point of a class like this? In a lot of other classes I have to, think about a subject and utilize what information I know from what I've taught or what I've read. And half the time in this class I feel like I'm just reading the sheer account of what's going on, trying to provide a little context, sure. But beyond the fact that, like if I put this on the Twitter account sometimes, that your history is your faith, I don't mean this in any reductive sense. But to hear how the faith reacts in the circumstance of the people who want it dead the most is an important reality for us all to hear. Unfortunately, when we hear the Catholic Church in the context of World War II and what should have been done among the Jews, and is Pius XII complicit, it always wants to devolve into mere political talk. And the same thing happens, unfortunately, with everything we've talked before with the Mexican and Spanish persecutions, and it will be the same for the last three when we talk as well. What I hope that in relaying these facts and these little stories, the little glimpses we have of these martyrs as people, is that beyond getting at what politically should have been done, that we learn that the proper response of Christianity is always a falling into the arms of God and being willing to take what comes next. Martyrs are not people who rush to the front lines in order to hope for a glorious death that they can, so to speak, brag about in the afterlife. But if our whole point in the faith is to take one step at a time in the present moment about what God wants, to hear the people who've gone before us in being willing to do so when it's so hard. On one hand, hopefully it makes it easier when it's just something like, my wife wants to eat at McDonald's and I want to eat at Sonic. I guess I can die to myself a little bit today and go to where she wants to. But beyond simple flippant things like this, the steady proof that when the time comes, God provides those who would listen to him with the courage to do so. We actually listen to this class in all its brutalities, not just to learn about the history of the faith and how much we owe to the blood of the martyrs to where we've got now. That we can't forget that this has just all recently happened in the scope of things. But to notice that God takes normal people, really. Some lady who had lost her faith and disagreed with her mom, who was getting a PhD, is girded with the strength to offer herself up as a sacrifice for her people. A Polish priest who, like a lot of us, has some health issue, who doesn't think that he's going to have the strength to continue on his mission, is given the strength to be the light of Christ in a starvation bunker for 2 weeks. But God will be there to accomplish these things. That the act of the martyrs is the acts of the hands of God. It is not hero worship. We are not talking about people who have special talents that they marshaled when the time came, but that God is ready to be alive in his saints. And that's what we have to prepare ourselves to. And that is the biggest lesson. That's the biggest lesson, that even in Auschwitz, God shows up. God shows up, and that God will show up in our lives, even our lives that are so different than Auschwitz, if we are willing to do his will. So thank you all, everybody. And it's always hard to say have a good week after we read such brutality, but have a good week.